Lower Ninth Ward is people didn't have the resources, and then the economy and the collapse of the subprime market in a city where we have relatively low incomes. I mean, Miami and New Orleans compete regularly in the top 50 cities for who's more broke-ass poor than the other, and you know, sometimes Miami's winning, sometimes New Orleans wins. But what it meant is without the resources, people could get insurance money, couldn't get road home money, which was how the federal government, you know, delivered money through the state government to help people rebuild their house for 3 years after the storm. And then by that time, you're in 2007, 2008, real estate market has crashed. There is no subprime market, so if you have credit that needs repair, what are you going to do? You're still $30,000 short on what you need to rebuild your house. And that's why in areas like the Lower Ninth Ward, even though this book ends on a very, you know, there's no Debbie Downer, it ends a very encouraging point. You know, the Lower Ninth Ward is picked as one of the areas that's going to be rebuilt. It gets the largest single appropriation from the commitment of the city and feds. But unfortunately, that money then wasn't delivered. Didn't get there. So it was a promise of money that took a while. If you're coming, come on. Yeah, we stop for people. We're glad to have you. We got seats galore. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay. You're in a situation where there's, you know, it's like the old time expression, there's more month than money, where people were looking at a proposition of what it would take for them to rebuild and not having the money, having insurance money, but living through life, and life includes health crises and whatever else. It doesn't mean you can hold on to that money year after year at the same little piggy bank while you're waiting for the federal money that's been promised to help you rebuild. And that means Lower Ninth Ward only has 15% of its population back, and we're still short somewhere between 80 and 100,000 of our citizens who haven't come back. That can't be what's part of the plan, and too many times part of the lesson of disaster, and this is part of what you see in Springfield too, is a deliberate urban renewal, a deliberate depopulation, particularly of lower income areas. And the rationale may be waiting for the plan to be done, which is what's happening in Alabama now. But it's sort of interesting if you look at Joplin, where I'm not saying anarchy took over in the Midwest, because I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetimes. But in Joplin, they allowed people to rebuild immediately. And they let the planning catch up to people's efforts to rebuild, reopen their businesses, whatever. Well, if you look now at where the tornadoes went through in the Birmingham area versus Joplin, you see huge amounts of Joplin rebuilt and almost nothing that's been done in Alabama because they're still waiting for the plan a year later to be finished. I kidded about this earlier today. I mean, if you live in New Orleans as I do, I wasn't from New Orleans, but I lived there a long time, went to high school there, never coming back, and a dozen years later we moved to the ACORN national office there, and there you are, and I'll end up, you know, now after Katrina, you don't have character if you leave, so they'll end up putting dirt in my face there. But so if you start me talking about Katrina, it's hard to really stop sometimes. So, you know, one of the things in the sort of post, you know, trauma stress syndrome kind of deal that so many people in New Orleans have, one of the things I try to measure is to actually turn myself off talking about it before I realize, oh my God, how much time went by and I'm still talking about the same issues. So I don't want to get over the top. The point of this book, though, is that here's how in the first 18 months the right to return was won, the right to rebuild every neighborhood was won, how a combination of organizational courage from the leadership who were willing to do God knows what in order to try to come home, live in almost any way, a staff that did the same, how everybody was able to come together. And those of us who are professional organizers know, in the best of times and in the worst of times, it's hard to bring everybody together. It's hard to get on the same page. It's not enough to have good politics. It's not enough to have a good heart. It's just sometimes very difficult to get all of the pistons firing at one time. And luckily, in ACORN's experience, during Katrina, was a time where people did actually do better than they were capable of doing, and all the pistons did hit. And fortunately, the persistence and the ability to hang into that fight allowed people to come to a point where they could have the right to win again, or to fight to rebuild. It's sort of different after finishing the book that all of a sudden you have an ACORN that doesn't exist, because it's a little bit like saying, hey, this is really great, this is capacity you need. Oh, sorry, you don't have that anywhere. You know, trust me on this. And that's not what I'm going to say, but it is unfortunately a situation where that role now has to be played by increasingly weakened labor institutions that have a membership base that care, other institutions that still are dedicated to some level of constituency support and accountability to the equity of low and moderate income people, and that sort of collection of community-based organizations that still do exist. There's a greater burden placed on them. But the one thing we have to be clear of is that the reaction to disasters is going to continue to be a struggle that we have to deal with, and we can't predict. So it really is one of those challenges when there are acts of God, and you know, having bargained many union contracts, you know, would always get to that section about acts of God in a contract, and you'd always sort of, your eyes would glaze, you wouldn't pay attention. I'd never do that again. It turns out, you know, a lot of those contracts we have that have acts of God, I wished I'd spent a lot of time on that, because all of a sudden when you're dealing with them, the guarantee to a job, the guarantee to return to a job, the guarantee of wages, how you, I mean, it turns out there's a million things you have to do in those agreements that we just assume it'll never happen here. And unfortunately, what I think we're finding more and more, and you can look at the environment, is all of this can happen almost anywhere. Our situation, having been to Indonesia after the tsunami, the similarity to what we saw in Katrina and what they saw there, very close. I mean, the fight to rebuild anywhere close to their livelihood, the fight to come back, whether the government, you know, sort of cordoned off Aceh and wouldn't let people go back. And the fact that you have to care whether or not people are more valuable than land. I mean, in Tokyo, which is actually lower than New Orleans, you have these massive super levees, they call them, and you'll have areas that are 15 feet below sea level that, because the land in Tokyo is very valuable, you could say cynically, they've been willing to invest in tremendous infrastructure, locks on the water dams, super, you know, levees, to prevent this kind of flooding that ends up in a situation like Katrina. Whether or not people just don't value the lives of people in New Orleans, or don't value the property in the same way they do in Tokyo, we're still fighting to get a real level 3, not a level 5 protection on levees, but a real level 3. There's no super levees being built. We're still arguing about the fact that the levees along Lakeview have been repaired, and the levees along Lower Ninth Ward still haven't been repaired. So this is not an Occupy New Orleans claim. This is just saying, hey, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. It could happen here. It has happened here. It's been, you know, great to talk to people in Springfield and unfortunately see how they did some things better, how they could have done other things differently, and to be here a year later and be able to talk about it is obviously a great experience for me.